introduce Brenda Williams, who sort of set up all the logistics.
I'm good.
How's it going?
Good. I had some last minute thoughts I wanted to
Okay.
write down. Yeah.
Good. It's going to be great. I'm so happy to have you. We're really excited
Thank you
for you to be here.
thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, it's an honor. Like, our grad students, we sent the word out and said, pick who you want, and you were it, and I'm like really happy.
I'm so happy that they picked me. I'm
Everybody
honored.
I told in New York, they were all like, oh my God, she's coming here. I was like, yeah. So really, we're really, really pleased to have you. Thanks for everything. Tell Leo I said you did a great job.
I will.
All right.
I think 2 is good. I have 2. I think 2 is fine.
Hi, all. My name is Peter Lunenfeld. I am Vice Chair of Design Media Arts, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the start of DMA's 1819 lecture series. A few little announcements. We have a great grad show that'll be open until Thursday at 5 called Convolutions in the New White Gallery, which is just outside. Unfortunately, it's not open now, but it will be open tomorrow and Thursday. And our next speaker is co-sponsored with our Art and Sci group, and that's Andrea Polly. So that will be on November 13th. We're absolutely delighted to have Juliana Huxtable kick things off. This past Thursday, she participated and gave the opening talk at the UCLA Art History Graduate Symposium at the Fowler. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a New York-based artist, writer, performer, and DJ, and I could keep adding commas and ands for a while. This past year was quite extraordinary. She had major bodies of work at both the New York Gallery Arena Spallings and a self-titled show at London's Project Native Informant. Her first, I believe it's the first book, Mucus in My Pineal Gland, is a collection of her poems, essays, and performance scripts, and an apocalyptic novella called Life, which she wrote in collaboration with the artist Hannah Black. Both of those books were recently published. As the Guggenheim Museum put it, Huxtable critiques existing social norms and categorical distinctions while indicating alternative, more hopeful possibilities. If there's one thing we need right now, it's more hopeful possibilities. And it's for that reason that I am delighted to welcome, to kick off this year's lecture series, Juliana Huxtable. Please welcome her.
Okay, I guess I'll start off by giving a condensed, just a little bit of background information that I think will be useful in understanding some of the work that I'm talking about later on. So I grew up in Texas in a Black Baptist family, and I spent a lot of time in church. And that, even though I don't really believe in God and I'm generally opposed to organized religion, I think that there are certain aspects of Southern Black Baptist religious culture that have stuck with me, and in particular, liberation theology is something that's been particularly important to me as both a kind of historical model that influences the way that I think about the potential for cultural production at large, but also as a kind of a way of approaching different text and reading text and coding things that has stuck with me. And liberation theology is essentially a school of religion that was developed. I mean, there's different branches of it. There's Latin American liberation theology, but specifically Black American liberation theology takes the premise, reads the Old Testament, and takes the sort of constant sort of persecution and exodus and like migration of the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and likens that to, if not makes it a direct kind of historical precedent to the Black American experience. And so what liberation theology also does in a lot of ways is it allowed like Black Americans to code sort of religious scripts, religious songs, religious motifs, religious images that they were given, and code them with a meaning that was bent on liberation instead of using it as a way of perpetuating a mentality and a sort of structure that was obviously designed to keep them enslaved. And so I think there's a really rich musical and artistic and literary history tied to the American liberation theology tradition, and I grew up in that, and that has something that has stuck with me over time. Growing up, I always wanted to be an artist and a poet, or a painter and a poet, specifically was what I wanted to be when I was younger. And I lied to my parents and said I was studying psychology and economics so that they would let me go to the expensive-ass school that I went to, Bard College. But when I got there, I decided to enroll in studio arts classes anyway. They later found out, and I wouldn't have been able to pursue that route either way, but I found my experience in art school particularly frustrating because I felt that the sort of creative license or the assumption that a lot of the kind of like wealthy Waldorf friends, like Quaker school kids with a lot of money had towards art was something that felt alien to me, because art to me at that time was a way of like exploring questions of like identity and place, and I don't think that that's so outlandish for an 18-year-old to have those aspirations, but I was told that I was trapped in my identity constantly, and so I didn't end up studying art. I studied literature and gender studies, and then I moved to New York to work in the ACLU. And so at this time when I moved to New York, I presumed that I would not be pursuing an art career in any literal way. I had put that on the back burner and thought, maybe I could do the nonprofit sort of industrial complex world. And while I was at the ACLU, there were two aspects of my life in New York that became seminal and were the kind of established the germination of my practice. And so one of those was Tumblr. So anytime that I had spare time, anytime I had finished something, instead of taking lunch breaks, when I went home, I was obsessively on Tumblr. And Tumblr and the community that it represented was a way for me to find, on the one hand, a sense of art history. Like I discovered a lot of artists that I look up to and a lot of artists that have been really fundamental to my practice. I discovered through these vague, loosely organized art historical communities on Tumblr, but also as a format in which the relationship between what one might call a producer and consumer was a little bit more ambiguous. And so it was in that space that the creative license that I didn't feel in school that I had was able to blossom. And so I started writing. Sometimes I would just write about an artist, or I would write about a song, or I would write about a mix. And that began to evolve into its own weird, like quasi-poetic stream of consciousness writing. And so that's how my writing started. I liked photo book on Mac or whatever, and so I would like post pictures and whatever. But it was fun, and it was a place of experimentation that I think was really essential to me, finding a space in which I felt like I had a sense of creative agency and license. And at the same time, I was working in nightlife, and nightlife in New York kind of functions as this, it's a cash and alternative economy, both in the financial sense, but also in the kind of social and symbolic sense. And so getting ready to go out to a party, and then when I started DJing, like what music I would play became opportunities to think about and experiment with sort of ideas that I had about the world. And so my writing kind of developed. My writing was really the first thing that sort of announced itself as something more, that's something that you might call a practice. And so this is an example of one of the early things I wrote. I hated my job. They were terrible to me there. And so sometimes I would write like really like passive-aggressive things and put them on the wall because it was a civil liberties union, so free speech. And so this is an example, just to give a little, I was also really angry at the time, but this is an example of something that I wrote that I think gleans where the writing started. a little bit of background to this. Like when I was in the office, people would always say, in a really like both sexist and like sexism combined with like a weird performative like class homophobia thing. Oh, you're too fashionable for the office. And so there was this idea that because I presented myself in a particularly feminine way, but also that I would be fascinated by fashion, that it somehow undercut or undermined my intellectual capabilities within the workplace. And it was something that was performed on a regular basis that was also done to other women in the office and other people of color in the office, usually by male or white male lawyers. Nerd, a term strategically used by white people on the cusp of middle-class oblivion to demean those around them deemed a reminder of their heightened awareness of their overall insignificance. Artificial distinctions within mass-produced white culture become the basis for performing a tangentially left-of-center identity. Conservative versus liberal, HBO versus TV, science fiction versus romantic comedy, not-for-profit versus for-profit, reading versus watching, verbose versus vernacular, glasses versus contacts, technology versus fashion, studying versus partying, etc. This identity is usually often asserted over and on another, often non-white subject in a desperate attempt to rationalize their insignificance as a choice to participate in practices deemed nerdy, all the while failing to understand the sad reality that one is the same as the other, white, bland, underwhelming, artificial, insignificant, normative. And so that was a lot of rants and screeds when I first started writing, and I think like that's was the initial genesis of where I was coming from. At the same time, the act of sort of like documenting, getting ready, and documenting sort of my own development as a set of characters that really played out in nightlife was a productive place for me to work from. And so I didn't think about it initially, but I was an obsessive shopper, and I was hosting on any given week, I was hosting like 5 parties, and every party I would like go out and buy a new outfit. And so there would be a period where I was fascinated with an idea of like anime futurism or Afrofuturism, or a period where I was particularly obsessed with period pieces and neck ruffs and like collars and like really, Victorian silhouettes. And so getting ready became not just an act of sort of like getting dressed and realizing myself visually, but also a practice in writing. And I started writing in tandem with the process of getting ready to go out. Let's skip over these. And so this is one of my little photo booth moments when I was obsessed with period piece clothing, and I wrote this in my journal at the time. Reliving images of green ivy, or actually it starts here, because this is a video that I made while I was getting ready. I'm gonna turn the sound off. I woke up today wanting to feel regal, dignified, modest, the way a Game of Thrones or Ren Fair period piece kind of look makes one feel. I walked into a room. The floor was covered in neck ruffs, outdated collars, corsets, veils, tapestries, and broken pieces of Greco-Roman columns. A large fan at the top of the room blew shreds of printed JPEGs of constitutions, decrees, revolutionary texts, and other things older, wider versions of the man past used to certify in word the merger of thought and object. The walls of this very large room were completely covered in screens, looping scenes of American actors speaking in British accents, playing characters both fictional and real-ish in nature, supposedly in ancient Egypt, 18th century France, Babylon, so forth and so on, all in British accents. The historical revealed itself to me as a cosplay, a fantasy fiction. And I'll skip the rest of that passage. And I also, during the same period, I started making these really rough photo booth collages of myself, and a little bit more from that piece, just to get into the headspace I was in. Reliving images of green ivy growing on the walls of secret gardens, foregrounding totemic prints of Naomi Campbell wearing an Elizabethan-inspired dress from the McQueen Fall-Winter 2013 collection. On my mind in another time. Watching my body drift through triangular passages seen at sea level as my eyes emerge just above the tumultuous waters that miss my nose thanks only to the grace of the angel of history, who holds me high enough to witness the vessels that bear the honor of digging out, to, in, and from material remains, nominating from the motley waste to tell the story of what came before. I'm dehydrated with impatience, thirsting for if the moment when free men and relics of the Harlem Renaissance cross into the twilight zone, that gray and unclear passage in the thick of yesterday, once upon a time in the historical, between a named period and the ancient. Where is the line, if there is a line, that moves up, and in what increments? When does a decade disappear into the cataclysmic mass, that which came after the historic but retains a certain pomp and circumstance of that which predates the merely old? There are certain facts that cannot be disputed. The Egyptians definitely didn't have pink nipples, even if their orifices were otherwise. And so this sort of this kind of process of getting ready and developing these characters to go out became the basis for what would later on be sort of explorations in visual and performance work. And also the process of documenting them and putting them online, and sort of like that kind of as a cycle in which I was starting to find moments in which I felt like I could have a sort of creative or artistic license or energy. And so I started to play with early characters more. Some of them are really, like, I think they're kind of cheesy, but whatever. This is where I was coming from at the time. And so this character is the first iteration of a character called Nuwabian Princess. And so in one of my kind of liberation theology Tumblr research hole branches, I realized that there's a particular kind of urban science fiction-based, what some might call a cult or pseudo-religion, where it's like the UFO theories of the Nation of Islam, which are grounded in a lot of like Egyptology, at least the sort of spin-offs, are grounded in a lot of Egyptology and ufology. So basically the humans were gifted sort of their subjectivity from aliens. There's a primordial aliens that came to Earth, created the original humans. The original humans were black, reptilian creatures, and then there's an explanation, and there's a whole like phrenology as to why black features are closely tied to reptiles. But it basically, this religion seeks to do a similar thing that just sort of Christian liberation theology seeks to do, which is grapple with the historical trauma of the African diaspora via a really bizarre combination of ufology, Egyptology, and the performative and sort of like visual and literary and musical tropes of Southern like Baptist liberation theology. And so the Nuwabian nation sees themselves as the direct descendants of these original kind of reptilian hybrids. And I was fascinated by that history, and so I thought incorporating myself as a Nuwabian character was fun for me. It was also really fun to go out painted like this, because it was sort of psychotic. And so I started to document myself a little bit more seriously, and I started thinking about landscapes and thinking about Afrofuturism, and so a lot of these references started to be pulled. I started to pull a lot of these sorts of references into the work, and I think what was particular about both the process of getting ready as something that's based in an idea of fashion, but also a sort of Tumblr relationship to references, is that it's really like anything goes as a sort of basis for building these collage type ideas or identities or stories or vignettes. And so my writing also started to develop. And there's one piece in particular that I wrote in response to my friend Stuart's show. And this was the press release to his show. That was really when I think I found a sense of synthesis in my voice. And I'm just going to read part of it. I always picked the girls when I played video games, if for no other reason than out of sheer spite at the ease of identification the boys around me had with their uninterestingly phallic and Kamehameha superheroes. With the assumption that there was some sort of inherent or tragic flaw in Princess Peach's Mario Kart 64 performance. Chun-Li's absurd curves and the cunt's meow screeching from every turn of her hyper-pornographic body fueled my rage against boyhood, albeit through arguably the most boyish of means. I discovered, using my virtual pussy to straddle the beefy trapeziuses of anthropomorphic cyborg attackers, that the awkward shortcomings of pubescent life could be overcome one pelvic head crush at a time. Like Motoko Kusanagi, my womanhood was entirely artificial, save my mind and the tingling sensation in my spine present at the revelation of a new level, especially one unlocked as a secret. Each time my artificial lungs lifted into the air as if I was Aeon, bravely denying vertigo of its affects as I spread my Amazonian legs and take in the rapidly moving air that traces the fantastical skyscrapers of Bregna. And so the visual language and the sort of language of my writing itself were developing at the same time, and it was a lot about sort of media and the media that I was consuming and finding in these kind of sort of random flights of interest that were generally being documented online on my blogs and whatever, various social media. And so I continued to sort of make this work, but this work largely existed, the visual work at least, largely existed online. I started to do readings more, and readings turned into performances where I would combine music with the text that I was writing. And so performance became the primary sphere in which my work started to circulate. And so people would ask me to do performances because the combination of text and music and video was something that was both interesting to me, but also practically salient to produce work in that context because it didn't cost that much, and I was generally broke throughout this whole period of time. And so it was in this context that I was asked to participate in the Triennial, the new museum Triennial. And so it was the first time that I had the opportunity. I had done one performance at the Whitney, but other than that, there wasn't so much institutional recognition or showing of my work at that point. And so Ryan and Lauren approached me and they asked me what project, what I wanted to do for the Triennial. And I think in mind, like they were familiar with the visual work, but they had presumed that I was primarily interested in performance. And I really wanted to step back, at least for that show, from performance, because performance as a genre felt, it's oftentimes relegated to like community programming. The fact that it didn't cost money for me was also reflective of the fact that it costs very little money for institutions. And so there's a circuit that you can get stuck in performing that really is not so productive as an artist. And I had a lot of visual questions that I wanted to like interrogate and ask. And so I proposed a series of images, of self-portraits that would take as their basis, using a sort of liberation theology lens to read a certain type of popular African-American household art. This is an example. And so a little bit more background. And so I was also interested in what it would mean to take a culture of images and to take self-documentation and self-portraiture, which was obviously I had already developed as the basis for my practice, also for practical reasons, but it was also interesting me to think of ways of understanding the sort of evolution or transition of a human being outside what I saw as the kind of pedantic, didactic conversation surrounding transness at the time. And so I wanted to make work that would both exist in the physical space of the museum, but also be about the documentation of that work and how that documentation then circulates. And so the work that I chose, the sort of basis and what I wanted to think about was there's a genre of African American, and it's also in a lot of like Caribbean American households that basically it's kind of this populist, almost kitschy, kind of cheesy portraiture that is it's like aspirational and sort of really astute in the way that it presents Black subjects. But I started to read them and read the sort of like symbols of them, and I found that there was a lot going on here. And I became interested in images as a way of coding something like a political impulse in the same way that liberation theology used the sort of structures and motifs of Christianity to insert an idea or a liberatory agenda. And so this image on the left is, like, growing up, we called that Black Tupac Jesus. He doesn't really look like Tupac, but when we were growing up, we thought that he did. But it essentially uses this figure, this like black male figure, Christ figure, and it's like impossible to separate the sort of like binding of his hands and that body from the legacy of American slavery. And what's interesting is that there's a whole kind of genre of this specific kind of like erotically charged black Jesus in some form of bondage. And it's interesting because even though Jesus is read as black, it's almost always the sort of like Roman soldiers or the people who are throwing rocks at Jesus or sort of humiliate him are always cast as white. And in particular, the sort of Christ story becomes a sort of elaboration, bringing a liberation theology sort of reading and lens into the New Testament. And it casts the body of Christ as a sort of motif or symbol of the black body politic at large. And the image on the right is a motif of images in which it's sort of black women sexualized, but also in kind of like vaguely warrior stances and anatomically impossible poses, oftentimes with, they'll have like a spear or some sort of weapon or kind of like warrior ornamentation on them. But they're almost always in a sort of problematic, like reductive, African jungle sort of background, but with Black Panthers. And to me, it was interesting that the motif of the Black Panthers would appear in this sort of in populist art, which sort of found its genesis around and right after the sort of war on drugs had decimated the literal black liberation movements. And so to me, I read this and saw this as a coding and taking those sort of political impulses and coding them into a sort of populist art that explicitly had the intention of being distributed in black households around the country. And so these are more examples of that. And so I used self-portraiture as a way to navigate these questions myself. Like, could I code an image that would both read as an Octavia Butler science fiction cover, but would also read as queer in terms of what it's doing with the history of the sort of female nude, but also appeal to a kind of problematic, essentialist, like return to Africa, a homophobic Hotep audience. And could the distribution of the image, and this image by encoding certain symbols in a way that's pretty simple, bordering on abstract, actually reach and circulate in those ways. And this one in particular, I think, was the most successful because so the Nubian Nation still exists. The guy who started the Nubian Nation is in prison because it was actually a cult and a lot of questionable things were happening. But his son runs the nation and followed me on Instagram for like 20 minutes before he realized what was actually going on and then freaked out and like deleted all of his comments and left. But the idea and the sort of intent behind the sort of liberation theology model, to me, was a way of thinking through this long history of not only these sort of populist images, but of different aesthetic strategies to addressing a desire for political agency, a desire to express, a world in which there's a certain sense of liberation. And the series was called Universal Crop Tops for all the self-canonized saints of becoming. I'm gonna skip this text because it's available online should you be interested in reading it. So this was my sort of update to the black woman in the anatomically impossible position, with like in a sort of warrior stance, but particularly as a sign of like black liberation and black power. But specifically what I found interesting about the original source images was that the black woman's body was now being used as the sort of symbol of the black body politic at large, which was an evolution from the initial genesis of these images. And so I started thinking of how that's been done stylistically, and so I started thinking of Hype Williams and Hood Surrealism and this sort of era during the 90s when you had Black women wearing like men's clothes and camo pants and like, combat boots and really intense earrings and cornrows and things that society at large, until very recently, I guess, saw as like really, really aggressive, but that sort of like particularly feminine way of dressing oneself in and of itself is a form of militancy, is a sign or expression or stance or alliance with a notion of Black power. And so I wanted to make my own sort of image where I abstracted those symbols another level, but also brought in these kind of pop cultural references that I think are often excluded when we're thinking about an art historical canon. There's also a lot of these images where it's like they take political figures and like they make them into like, it'll be like Obama as like a 12-year-old boy with like an oversized basketball jersey and like 3 little girls like swooning over him or something. But I loved this idea of taking like literal political leaders and making them these almost like precious moments, objects of desire in a weird way, which sort of took their symbolic power and did something to it that wasn't so much like worshiping at the altar of male leaders. This was my kind of interpretation of the Black Christ, because I thought in an interesting way, especially at that time, this was in 2015, the rhetoric surrounding the sort of like death of Black trans women and Black non-binary people, I felt like at that time, there was a lot of media attention on that. So what would it look like if I was to reinterpret a sort of Christ-like figure, but thinking of the sort of trans body as a motif for an idea of a larger body politic, and giving it the sort of symbolic weight of a Christ narrative or Christ story. Later on that year, so also in that exhibition, I showed those works, but there was also a 3D printed sculpture of my nude body that was on display. And what I could not have really had the foresight to grapple with was how intrusive and intense that would feel and objectifying that would feel, to like walk through a mall and have someone be like, I've seen you naked, or like, even just a simple interaction at a bar turning into a presumption that because of that sculpture, that my body was this like weird commodity that everyone had already had access to in a weird way, in a really unsettling and uncanny way. And so I had been working on performance for Performa, and I really wanted to think of performance not in the traditional sense in which you're using a sort of your body to provoke something from an audience, in a way that also relies, it's like, there's like a cult of youth, a cult of attractiveness that sort of follows the history of performance. But I wanted to use performance as a way of actually removing myself and abstracting myself via the performance. And so really immersing myself in text and visuals and sound and like live vocals, but the actual thing that is doing the least is my body, and that felt like a sort of necessary rejoinder to what was happening before and the like circulation of images of my body, which felt really violent in a lot of ways. And so the theme of Performa that year was loosely tied to the Renaissance. Not necessarily the literal kind of European Renaissance, but including if the artist wanted to take that on. And so I immediately went back to my previous obsession in like 2013 when I had bought all of the period piece clothing, and wrote that piece about there are certain facts that are not be disputed, and that's where the title of the performance came from. And what this performance sought to do was elaborate like what was going on. Like, what is it about wearing an outfit to the Ren Fair? Like, what does that participatory high, where is that coming from? And so I started thinking about history and connections to history and connections to antiquity as a sort of a universal desire, at least in a sort of contemporary moment, that we all want to be attached to a notion of history or to some sort of legacy. And I was thinking, like, when you're younger in class and and all of the kids get up and they're like, my last name is MacArthur, and like I've traced that back to some like knight in Scotland, and I was always like, I don't really know. My grandparents are from Alabama. And so there's also a particularly wounded attachment that I have to this kind of like genre of desire in relationship to sort of just like basic subject formation. And so the performance basically charted how that was sort of warped and evolved via the sort of birth of, both of my parents were heavily involved in tech, and so I had a computer when I was 3. I was already, making like Microsoft Paint art or whatever. And so there was and both of my parents also saw technology and the idea of the web as like, this is the get out card for sort of like oppressed people. And so they really, really emphasized having a fluid relationship with technology as a way of like social and economic mobility, et cetera, et cetera. But for me in particular, the early era of the internet in which GeoCities and Angel Fire and things like that were happening really offered this idea that there was a direct alternative to the failures of the sort of Western canon as it's presented through something like a reference library. And so what I couldn't find in Encyclopedia Britannica, what I couldn't find in World Book, I could find in this entire world of alternate scholarship. And there were a lot of websites at the time that I was obsessed with, finding like pre-colonial African history or, whatever kind of the alternate version of scholarship. And so, and even the language of the early internet was like cast in like pages and scripts and scrolls, and it implies there's a language that has a relationship to a sort of the texture of paper or the archive or something like that. And so the first section was called Transitions, and I was really interested in the idea, particularly in the Italian Renaissance, of this obsession with the classical. And so in a culture that's totally dominated by feudalism and by a really sort of strict relationship to the church, poets like Petrarch are painters that return to a notion of antiquity and classicism to then reread and sort of inject a secular energy into religious work and religious poetry and things like that. And so the first section was called Transitions, which just was an attempt to trace the sort of history, the like visual history of, and the sort of aesthetics of how history has been presented to us. So why do they always speak in British accents in period piece films, even if it's in like Japan? It doesn't make any sense, but it's obviously, somewhat related to the history of British colonialism. And so the performance, I'll read a little bit of the performance text to sort of show the headspace that I was in. The totality of recent history is swallowed by a single obtuse comparison. Retrospective value generated in the accumulated resistance to a rapid succession of technology. Air over the fleshy vessel of a young dreamer, propelling her forward, hoping to crash into stains to wear pridefully. I'm looking for alternate sources of energy, images of fossils that fuel the creators of World Book and Carta, the painters and illustrators they consulted, scientists really. The immaculate in vitro fertilization and birth of the infographic comes from this progeny. A muse mother tracing out strokes and gestures. Certain image tropes bestow the honor of neutrality as origami structures flatten to quadrangles, pinched at 90-degree angles, spread across found paper. Archaean, Proterozoic, Phanerozoic, Apolozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. And so I was thinking about the sort of history of the design history of the way that these sort of passages of life on Earth are portrayed, and combining that with things like British accents and period piece films as the sort of foundation with which, as what I saw a potential against in the internet and in GeoCities and in Angel Fires and things like that. And so thinking about images like this or images like this. And so it was about the transition from this culture, this highly problematic culture that reduces also the span of human history to almost like imperceptible like minutia, which not that it's not in the larger scheme of things, but that essentially all of the crimes of human history would be erased by the way that a designer like lays this out, as if this is a reflection of the sort of like moral or kind of like ethical weight of what history is. Only the objects preserved remain in this water world. Modeled gametes and taxidermied lizards, elderly amphibians, remodeled ape skeletons, and Germanic hunchbacks. Figures in natural history museums elaborate intricate stills from 3D films with no sounds. Reprinted in the spatiotemporal monument to memory that resides in my pineal gland. Exacted data drawn exclusively from mental traces. Pieces in memory. I could sculpt the scene given the time with my bare hands. There's no risk of losing the source image, a spitting image, savages in front of a slice of panorama, fantasy depictions that conjecture the truth of a history, storybook illustrations, a Neanderthal shrugs, giggles to himself. I think he gets what's going on. It took me far too long to. The aliens erected in the Roswell UFO Museum don't smirk or break laughter because they know their role in saving lives. And so the second section of this performance was, it was called Mourning, and it was basically sort of, there was a moment in high school when I tried to go back and find all of these sites that I was really attached to, and I found that they weren't there. And you know, when GeoCities decided to shut down, it decided to close its servers and no longer host all of those web pages. There was a debate that was at one point just a sort of like Yahoo as a company is just like, why would we keep this outmoded form of technology? But there was a really sort of like deeply emotional connection and developmental connection that I had with GeoCities and with Angel Fire and with like a lot of just independent websites that then presented not only themselves, but the web at large as ultimately ephemeral and not at all an alternative to the sort of materiality of an encyclopedia or an archive or something like that. And then the last section was called Avatars. And Avatars was thinking about different potentials of relating to these fundamental desires. And so thinking of something like, there's this like Tumblr blog called Medieval POC, where they basically go through like old paintings, but like it started off just the medieval period, but now it sort of spans a really wide range of sort of the history of European painting and the representation of people of color in those paintings. But the sort of screen as the moment of contact and the sort of a visual culture, a symbolic culture that takes fashion, gaming, cosplay, all as potential sites for working through similar questions of these fundamental relationships to history and identity and antiquity. And so that was the last section, and I'll play a little video because linking this sort of culture of like cosplay and
so this is the first one, is the first.
Linking the culture of like cosplay and gaming and fashion with what I felt when I looked at subjects who have been depicted in painting, the idea that being painted was inserting yourself into some sort of canon or legacy or leaving a sense of like, or leaving something for a progeny's sake. And so I wanted to combine this sort of like playful relationship to kind of like fashion and visual cultural references with an idea of the history of painting. And that's where this video comes from.
One is like, you just bought this outfit because you're newly freed. Okay, now you're giving, I'm in the nightgown and he's letting, like, Massa say I can get my picture taken. You're channeling, I'm in Massa's nightgown. And then some where you're just like mimicking like a sort of like what you might imagine if you were sitting for like actually having someone paint your portrait. Getting into the power of like the height of a chin and a chest in profile. Get into the ruff, get into the collarbone, get into the ridges of the fabric, the feeling of the fabric. You're getting your picture taken. This pose is like you're a grandmother. And you're like taking your photo and like it's just you having your photo taken, but all of your grandkids are looking at you and you're like really like selling your wisdom and you're like feeling of like, you know, you're getting ready to like fight in the Revolutionary War and you put these pants on and they symbolize a form of patriotism and a break from your British past. You're brimming with like revolutionary spirit. Mourning, brimming chest. Yeah, you're getting ready to go fight a war, you're brimming with patriotism, you're not actually fighting the war yet, but you're getting into the idealism of it. Oh my god, you know what you are? You are Scottish, and you're dealing with an ongoing series of invasions from the British because they're trying to like take over whatever territory that you've had. And the next pose, like think about like what does the like that
For time's sake, I'm gonna stop that video. And so that was that body of work, which was generally kind of an elaboration of like what essentially started off as an experiment in getting dressed in my room. And so I had about a year after that to work on what I wanted to deal with my solo show, with my first solo show. And specifically, I felt, this was before Trump was even a serious candidate. I had started thinking of this, but I felt a sense of crisis, particularly in how a sense of agency, political agency, can express itself. So like whatever, I go vote, but like it also so obviously feels like a sham, and so in so many ways. And so in this kind of culture of like blatant political crisis, what might be a model for finding a sense or grounding a sense of agency? And so there was a lot of sort of like public kind of chastising and shunning of conspiracy culture and paranoia culture. And so I thought, instead of like opposing and shunning the idea of the conspiracy theorist or the paranoid person, why not think about or embrace paranoia as a potential starting point for a different idea of politics? And what I like about paranoia and a paranoid mentality and a sort of conspiracist mindset is that it starts from the assumption that the absence of something is proof of an omission, is proof of like a conscious omission, or at least as a strong suggestion of a conscious omission of something, which felt to me really resonated with the idea of what a lot of activists were dealing with in the late 60s. So I was thinking about queer liberation and women's rights and early Black power movements that were obviously under siege from the federal government and other kind of groups that were directly in opposition to their agenda. And so this idea, which is a fundamentally paranoid mindset, that you know something is happening to you, you feel like something is undermining you, but the lack of evidence is actually just further proof of how efficient the system is and how synthesized that system is. And I was fascinated by conspiracy also particularly because it's kind of a race to the bottom. Like there's no real ending point in a sort of conspiracist mindset. So maybe thinking of a potential for an idea of like a political union or affiliation might be more, you might be able to find that at whatever the bottom of that rabbit hole is, more likely than you are through whatever conventional modes of thinking about politics that we have now. I'm not gonna play the video because I'm talking a lot. And so I wanted to think about, well, maybe I'll play a little bit of the video.
Well, obviously because I wanted to change the world.
The Feminist Scam is absolutely a political act.
I mean, somebody had to, so why not me?
I was an indigo child.
Everything feels impossible right now.
No KKK, no fascist USA. No Trump, 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 no KKK, no fascist USA.
Alright, so I haven't been to a protest or a rally or whatever in so long, and I was excited, but I wasn't really gonna go. But Bailey was in the area, so I was like, alright, cool, I'll come through.
What do we want? Stand up, fight back.
What do we want? Stand up, fight back. What do we want? Stand up, fight back. What do we want? Stand up, fight back.
Girl, I'm over this.
Well, these chairs are so lame.
It's not my jam.
Are you fucking serious?
What's so fucking funny? Don't you realize all of our lives are on the line right now?
What's so fucking funny? Don't you realize all of our lives are on the line right now?
First of all, you need to calm down. We're all complacent and chodes anyways.
The LGBT Center gets all of its money from corporations anyways.
That doesn't mean that what's happening here isn't important, and your millennial cynicism isn't getting us anywhere anyway.
Neither's your delusional idealism.
We're here because we have no other option. This is our only home.
I've never really thought of it that way. And then I was like, could I get your information?
He got her information and they followed each other on all applicable social media that night. The next day, he DM'd her and recounted a dream he had of 10,000 cut-off fists, warping, stretching into nothing, something like a black hole, or maybe not, but it terrified him. He stopped donating to the ACLU the following day.
To vote or not to vote! In protest of nihilists refuse! I fucking can't! I refuse!
Girl, you know I'm not voting.
To the streets, they said. We've sat far too long in illusion. Now is the time for direct action.
No KKK, no fascist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no fascist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no fascist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no fascist USA!
Wait a minute. That's kind of correct though.
It's crime.
Hey.
No KKK, no fascist USA! No Trump! No KKK, no.
I'll stop that there. But so the show kind of took the name A Split During Laughter at the Rally came during the initial era, like during when Trump was first inaugurated, and it was like every week, like every day was a new horrendous policy that was being passed. And so I felt like there was, on the one hand, it was a sort of an intentional exhausting, but it pushed me and like friends when we would be at rallies to a kind of point of hysteria. And at one point, like me and my friend Bailey looked at each other and just started hysterically laughing because it felt so, the whole thing felt so tragicomic. And so I started thinking about the idea of the sort of idea of where or like how did we get to this point? And so it's both a political crisis in the sense of just like voting and the systems that exist, like obviously don't serve the interest of the majority of people, but it's also an epistemological crisis in the sense that there's an increasing pluralization, fabrication, and redefinition of knowledge, of facts, and of facthood as a state or quality shaping what is perceived as and subsequently acted upon as truthful. And in an era where the very notion of media, its forms, photography, film, the news, and industries personified in the notion of the media, Hollywood, the system, is widely distrusted as an epistemologically and therefore ethically valid institutions. In other words, the very formats and sources of media are distrusted and assumed to be conspirators in an agenda that does not have the interest of the people in mind. Our political imagination, the autofiction of oneself as a citizen, is figured, mythologized, and rendered through systems already plagued with collective, splintered distrust and outrage, rested to a simmering of indifference and exasperation. And it's from this point that I started to ask, not only what would a sense of political agency look like, but what does a political aesthetic look like? What is a revolutionary aesthetic? What is a leftist aesthetic? Is that even a possibility at this point? And so I started thinking about, in the most recent, at least American history, when there was a time when an image could directly convey a set of political agendas or goals or aspirations. And so I was thinking of the mid to late 60s through early 70s in particular, and the rise of images surrounding the Black Panther Party and also the international and domestic communist parties. And so you have an image of like, a Black auto worker from Chicago holding hands with a Chinese like factory worker, and they're both holding each other's hands, and there's like a beautiful pastoral background with an exploding kind of block cut print, like rays of sunlight behind them. But like what what has changed from that era, and in what ways does that political history and that aesthetic history linger in the way that we think about our aestheticized notions of politics today? And so I made a series of posters and buttons, because buttons were a really interesting kind of intersection to me as like as almost a pure signifier, at least at one point, of a kind of political statement. And so each of these dealt with sort of one of the kind of conspiratorial worlds that I was fascinated with. This one is called The War on Proof, which just addresses the idea of the impossibility of grounding a sense of truth, especially aesthetically. And I was thinking of the debates that were happening over how many people were at Trump's inauguration versus how many people were at Obama's versus the Women's March, and everyone's throwing images at each other. And then one person just comes in and says, it's all Photoshopped, and then you're back at like square one, and that kind of downward spiral as symbolic of the larger relationship between images and the idea or possibility of truth. This one is called Herculean's Prophecy. I think it's interesting in a conspiratorial mode, the ways in which there's like weird affiliations or allegiances, ideological allegiances take place. And so I was thinking about the intersection of really, really, really almost like apocalyptic kind of Christian of evangelicals and ecofeminists who both gender the world, and their rhetoric around like the apocalypse or the prevention of the apocalypse is dependent on on a female gendered notion of the earth. The right-wing sort of like evangelicals see the earth as a salacious whore who's ultimately seeking her proper punishment, and they're like so excited for the world to end because that's when Jesus comes. But also you have the ecofeminists that are, you know, promoting an idea of the earth as, you know, the idea of Gaia, like this sort of like earth mother being that needs to be protected, that's being raped and pillaged and violated by the sort of unhinged progression of industrial capitalism. And so some of the buttons would say things like, you know, gay for Gaia, or why protect what the Lord had marked for destruction, positivism is foreplay to apocalypse, or another one said something like pray to end veganism. It was really fun playing with the buttons. Were also just really fun. I love making them. And so this one is called The Feminist Scam, and it was about thinking about the ways in which feminism in a sort of conspiratorial world is vilified from different, like oftentimes competing factors. And so you have the Alex Jones, the sort of Alex Jones, like I have my gun, the federal government's gonna try and take my land away from me in the end days, sort of like motivated by the feminist agenda, which is really irrational, obviously, but the ways in which that aligns with a lot of naturalist movements. And so you have a sort of certain streams of Black nationalism that see feminism as a direct threat to the proper heterosexual foundations of a Black society, and see the sort of political stakes of Black liberation as the literally procreation. And so some of the buttons on here were like Misandrous United, you know, decalcify your pineal gland, cross-dressers for Christ. And then there was a mug of feminist tears that I found online, and I thought that was a funny inversion of the sort of like male tears, coffee cup genre. This one is called the Transsexual Empire. There's also a really bizarre obsession with trans people, and as a sort of representative of the ultimately the end of days, and from all sides, like the sort of vitriol launched at the idea of trans people is really specific. But even within a sort of like gay and lesbian model versus a trans model or something, and so some of the buttons on here were like "Don't call me cis," turf wars. Something that, you know, radical non-binary blogger with that like Mickey Mouse middle finger. And yeah, and then the last one was called, was an Invisible Shadow, Secret Units of Control and Profit, and it was basically the sort of, the paranoid genre that it's an elaboration or an evolution of the tinfoil hat. So you have chemtrails, and so you have the sort of Alex Jones type who feel like the government is putting estrogen in chemtrails to emasculate the like virile American male population, or that Bluetooth speakers are like secretly like, you know, making us more docile in relationship to a sense of political like agency or something like that. And I thought that this was a really interesting world of like a sort of conspiratorial world that I got really fascinated with. And so some of the buttons here said things like, hell is a world with only Bluetooth speakers, don't trust the Wi-Fi, or like the American sheeple. You can see close-ups of all of this online. I guess I'll just let this, you can find, this is essentially, it's like a weird, it's a flow chart it's like, because I also wanted to deal with the kind of combination of the confessional social media mode as a direct expression of a sense of nationalism or political agency or affiliation. And so this is a flow chart that basically starts, it's a fake Facebook post from me in which I talk about this guy that I hooked up that happened to have a shaved head. And then I was at the Black Lives Matter rally, and he was like chugging milk with like all of the like Proud Boys and white supremacists. And so then it goes into a whole thing of like, well, why would a white supremacist be attracted to a black woman in the first place? And then it goes into the history of skinhead culture and the sort of relationship between, because skinhead culture originally came from a hybrid of Jamaican immigrants in the UK, dance hall and ska sort of like combined with mod culture, and then you get the genesis of punk. But the original idea of a skinhead was really directly tied with the sense of anti-racist action, pro-immigrant stances from British punks that ultimately through there's a long history, but anyway, that's articulated on here throughout this flow chart, and it's essentially a way of like showing the kind of shoddy, how you can get from a sort of confessional mode in social media, like making some sort of statement about a personal experience and end up at these like larger grand narratives about forming your idea of a political identity or a political history or something like that. But all of these are available online. And then I'll just really, really quickly, the next show that I did was dealing with sort of like using the kind of history of punk culture in the UK and the co-optation of skinhead culture from the National Front as a symbol of white supremacy, as a sort of prefiguration of our current political crisis. So essentially what happened is that you have punk skinhead culture, which was really anti-fascist, really anti-racist explicitly. And then the National Front during an economic crisis in the 80s basically took that symbol and saw that symbol as something that could be used to recruit British youth. And so then you had the birth of the white supremacist neo-Nazi skinhead. And basically what happened is that the anti-racist skinheads were like, now the racist skinheads are wearing the same clothes that we are, so how do we differentiate ourselves? Okay, instead of wearing our bomber jacket right side out, we're turning inside out, and the green and the orange or red side being flipped out is now a sign of being anti-racist. But then that was co-opted in fashion. And then it becomes this sort of race to the bottom, and that kind of like aesthetic crisis that's directly related to a sort of like visual language that identifies one explicitly as fascist or anti-fascist, racist or anti-racist, I think prefigured the sort of crisis that we were in now. And it ultimately ended up where it's like in 2003, outside of a Fred Perry sample sale in Paris, it was like the neo-Nazi skinheads versus the anti-racist skinheads were fighting at a Fred Perry sample sale. And I was like, this is like actually just like hyper real. And so this show was thinking through that and thinking through the crisis of thinking through that crisis and using the sort of history of symbolism and fashion in a sort of punk context as something that could maybe offer a model to deal with or think about or grapple with what's happening now, because I think what happened in the sort of like a British punk culture directly foregrounds what is currently happening in America, where you're like, I don't know if you're an alt-right person or, a Bernie bro that just like likes mustache wax, and you like can't really tell the difference between the two. all of this work is available online. It was also thinking about reclaiming a sense of punk legacy back to its original kind of like, it's really a hybrid culture that was initiated by like Black immigrants in conversation with working class British white people. And so thinking about the idea of a punk mentality and what that term means and the cultural weight that it carries and reapplying that to different aesthetics, you know, even in an American context. And then the latest body of work I'm working on is kind of about trans-speciesism, but it's sort of in development, so I don't need to say that much, and I'm running out of time, so I'll just show you these two portraits I made. Am I okay? Okay. Is anyone interested in hearing? Okay. So there was that show, the sort of like fashion crisis. Also, I really loved specifically because buttons are so symbolic in this sort of like history and thinking about the symbolic language of a sort of like political aspiration or a stance, because what punks effectively did was take the sort of visual language, even in flyers, early album covers, but also specifically in like patches and buttons that people would wear, was take a history of political announcements. So like a union patch or a button stating one's affiliation with a labor union or something is directly replaced with a band, or is directly replaced with like Vivienne Westwood would put a cover of like, the British Prime Minister at the time, and with blood coming down from their eyes or something. But it's interesting to me thinking of fashion as the stage, and fashion as a marker of visual culture as the stage in which we process concerns that previously would have been limited to a more explicitly political sphere that, presumably outside the realm of aesthetics. And so this latest body of work that I'm working on now is about a sort of crisis of identity, thinking of like Rachel Dolezal, but also thinking about trans racism and the idea of trans-speciesism in particular, and also the sort of crisis over what a gender essentialism is. And so if we have now proved that there are chromosomal variations and intersex people exist, like now it's like the sort of journey towards interiority as the basis for an idea of an essentialism. And so instead of fighting against the notion, at least sort of as an experiment, of the idea of a transracial identity or something, over-identifying with that, and thinking of like furry culture and the visual representation of human-animal hybrids as a potential site for thinking about desire, but gender, and using kind of the language of trans-speciesism as a lens to play with ideas surrounding gender or race, or both of them, or all of them at the same time. And so this is a portrait that I made of my friend Bailey. And I've been making these wallpapers because I really like I've been inspired by the science fiction illustrator's obsession with finding ways of basically making human genitalia into like lightly disguising it, but also thinking about, I was fascinated with fungi and like the thousands of different sexes, and so thinking of different ways to imagine an orifice or a nipple or a protrusion or something that serves a sexual function or as a site of sexual desire. And so that's where the backgrounds are coming from. And this is my first light furry self-portrait. And that's all.
We'll take questions, but actually, you have a mic right back here. Because we record and live stream, please ask your questions in there. Thank you. Anybody? I'm going to go all the way back to what you started with, which was you talked about how when you got to Bard and you went into the art department, you felt completely closed off And I'm just interested, since one of the things we do is teach art, how you would rework that to not feel that in order to get to this either quicker or in a way that you'd want to.
Well, I feel like there's already a different starting point here in the sense that Bard had a crisis of diversity. So, like, I graduated with 600 something people, and there was less than 20 Black people, and so already that is a starting point. But teachers and a sort of campus culture in which the really wealthy kids were drawn to studio arts, and so basically the art department early on, in my experience, like privileged, like I put a Post-it note and kissed the canvas with Play-Doh, and they were like, go off, this is the most inventive thing I've ever seen. And I was like, really? We're 17 years old, but okay. But I think that there was also a culture, because for me, like school, it's like I'm going to be $80,000 in debt. I feel like I should learn something in art school, whether it's a technical skill or like something beyond just being told that what I made when I was like stoned and didn't have time to finish the assignment is brilliant. But also the idea that any sort of questions related to, I became the identity person, and so I remember I asked my professor a question because all we had learned to paint in terms of like figure painting were white models, and when I was painting myself, I was like, I feel like a little bit ill-equipped to depict myself in a weird way, because like light, the relationship between light and my skin and all of these models that we've been studying is fundamentally different, and I don't understand that. And the response that I received from professors was, you're trapped in your identity. Like, it's the sort of same model. And there was this basically being trapped in identity, and this was like friends that were in creative writing. It was also, that's what they were told also. And so the creative arts at Bard, at least at the time, pushed out almost all of the students of color. People just felt totally alienated, because when they would raise concerns, if those concerns happened to be related to what the professor could see as identity, it was assumed to be remedial, closed-minded, unable to really access the free flow of an artist or something like that. When I was like, I know that everyone's just like stoned and like took an Adderall and did this in 5 minutes, but like I don't think this is like a fair culture. And so, and it was just really expensive, and I didn't have any money, and I didn't realize how expensive things like oil paints and stuff were, and there was no support system there for that. And I found my professors to be insensitive, and I just felt alienated, and so I stopped taking those classes.
I was wondering about the intersection of your work in nightlife and the kind of culture it creates. I was wondering if you could speak about how, like maybe how the nightlife is informing like your more current work, because it was really like seen in your past work, and I was wondering if it is kind of more in like the background informing it, or if it's kind of separate now.
I would say the way that it manifests now, I mean, the people that I collaborate with, almost all of them I've met in a nightlife context. And then it comes out in other ways, like I throw parties, and so I'm obsessed with party lights. Like I have so many different types of lights, and so when I'm doing self-portraiture, it's nightclub lighting essentially that I'm using to shoot myself most of the time. And so I think in subtle ways like that it influences and how I collaborate with people. But I think at the same time, there's a certain joy that I feel in that they're not totally collapsed, because the sort of the culture of the art market can be really suffocating and intense and like not so free and fun and cute sometimes. And so I think I also, I'm at a place now where I enjoy that they're not necessarily collapsed. And so like even with the performance stuff that I'm doing, I've feared, because it started off just like text and kind of kind of music-ish, but it's evolved into like now where I'm just making music, and so it's nice now to just make music and just play that at a music festival, and it doesn't have to only function in a sort of art or performance market, and so I think I enjoy that there's a little distance between the two, but it informs that, you know, in terms of my interests, like throwing parties will always come out, and how I like organize things, like the colors that I use, like the music that I listen to, like has a direct influence on how I'm processing my work, and sometimes I make things for parties that I do, and so that's kind of what I've been really interested in lately is making work for the purpose of providing some sort of ornamentation or a moment of immersion within the space of a party, and so that's kind of right now I am kind of interested in that.
You kind of already spoke to a question that I had just by what you just said, but I guess I'm just curious about how when you've been making like objects, and in the way you talked about your early practice, it wasn't so object oriented, and I guess I'm just curious if you could speak a little more to sort of like navigating the objectness of the work you're making, like especially with those propagandistic posters.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about how those could have functioned as like prints, but they're not, they're like sculptures, and they're circulating in a very specific context and market, and same with thinking about a sculpture of your body like becoming this like object that then has its own like life.
Mm-hmm.
And just comparing that to like a party or something, like maybe just
well, I think initially I didn't make objects just because I just didn't have the money to, but I've always been interested in it. I also feel there's certain types of art that I think are able to carry a certain, almost like an ethical currency in the art world, in the sense that they are less inherently less related to commodification, and so performance is one of those spheres where it's like if you can do performance and people are into what you're doing, you're given a lot of like credit in a certain way because you're doing what you're doing knowing that you make no money. But I also don't think that it's fair to put artists in the position where they can't support themselves, because like when I was doing performance, I had no money. There was no way that I would have been able to support myself. And I also got tired of like me having to be there as the thing. That is so exhausting, especially when you have a naked, like 20 naked sculptures of you floating around. It's really exhausting for you having to be there, to be the primary sort of proxy through which people engage the ideas that you're trying to navigate. And so it was liberating for me in a lot of ways to also make physical work. And it's a really, I love text. I love the different ways that people use text. Like one of my primary, because writing is still the sort of initial way. Like the genesis of most of my ideas comes in writing, sometimes sketches, but mostly writing. And so in a particularly American way, I love like bumper stickers and jackets and patches and buttons and signs. And I think there's a lot of potential in the relationship between text, but text as like a physical object. There's a lot of space there for humor in a weird way. I'm right now I'm working on a series of bumper stickers. I love, like prime bitch behind the wheel or whatever, people have, like that culture is so fascinating to me. And so it's really one of the primary ways that I'm drawn to object-based work is as an expression of text, but also as a way to still use and document myself, but without having to be fully present. And in regards to how those things circulate, that's part of the trap of being an artist, and a lot of at least if your work is circulating in a particular way. The show, I try and make I really value the actual shows themselves. Like, I don't even feel, like I'm attached to the work, but I'm more attached to the images that I have of the work than I am the works themselves, because the show is really important to me. And the fact that that show was in New York, and my friends that I've also like party with were like in the video and they were at the opening, and that was something that was open to the public, was really important to me. And so like for that show, I didn't really feel like I was compromising, because even though it's a private gallery, it was open, and I was like really intense about being like, come see the show, come see the show. And so it felt like I was expressing sentiments that were informed by relationships that I had with people, but those people were also able to partake in like what the show signified and what it did or didn't do. And then in London, that's part of the reason why I wanted to do the show about the sort of the history of punk specifically within London, and like the history of like the relationship between immigration and white nationalism and class struggle in London. It felt important for me to do something specific in that context. And I've never made, like I've had work that has ended up in like museums, and I'm always happy when they end up in public institutions. I'm lucky in the sense that most of my work ends up in public institutions, even if it's not immediately on view or something like that. And so I know that that question will become more complicated as things like art, making work for an art fair or something is a much different economy. I made 2 new posters actually for an art fair, and I was nervous about what that context was going to be like, but that's also part of the role of a gallerist, and that I trust John and Emily, and it was like given to a public institution, and so I know that that's not going to be in someone's house. And the one poster whose house it's in is just like kind of a central like lesbian maternal figure to me and to the community at large. I'm like, I love that it's in her house. I'm like, absolutely, yes please. She also published my book, so it's like that as like the collector who's buying my work, I think is amazing. And her house is open to, you know, her house is all, in a lot of ways, is a semi-public space, at least in a certain kind of like queer feminist community in New York, so. But I know that that will get murkier. Cool.
That's it. Wait, was there something else? Oh, yeah, we've got one more question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you grew up on reading or watching like science fiction, and like particularly like what science fiction, and if that was just like around like being around computers at an early age, and also if like when you were looking at like the sort of the contradictions between skinheads, like progressive white archetypes, it's like fashion. Did you ever think that some of those people were like looking at some of like Futanari and like these anime like hypersexual alien cow whatever, I forget them. Yeah, I don't even know if there's like a term for it. But did you ever think that like they were looking at that, and did that thinking grow, or like did that project relate to your work right now that's like more in that realm? And does it still tie back to those like early days of like, you know, kind of like zoning out on like some science fiction shit?
Mm-hmm. I was in, I mean, that's one of the ways. I didn't talk to my dad for a long time. We're cool now, but one of the things that I really missed about my relationship with my dad was that he was obsessed with science fiction, and so, but in a like very like we had to watch Fridays and like on the Sci-Fi Channel, like that's what we did every Friday when we were at my dad's house. And The Fifth Element was like the family movie we like loved, but that was just like there was no higher form of cinema. And we would play like we had family LAN parties, and so we would play like whatever, like Star Trek Next Generation, but we would each of our rooms via our home local area network would play games together. And so there was a lot of science fiction in that form. I think my favorite science fiction, at least that I was introduced to via my father. My mom thought it was all just like demonic devil trash. But Heavy Metal magazine is my dad read heavy metal, and he's really pretty open. And like we had our first sex talk when we were like 10 years old. I was like, this is kind of weird, but okay. But he opened up all of his like literature to us, and Heavy Metal magazine is kind of like, it's a periodic illustrated, it's like they have like a bunch of illustrated stories in it. Sometimes they just have fantasy spreads. So like Olivia, the sort of like airbrush artist Olivia, who will paint like, a woman who's like turns into a zebra, and she has like shark fins coming out of her back, and the bottom of her legs are a zebra or something that's really erotic. Like they might feature, like Olivia would do a fantasy spread for heavy metal, and it was really erotic and like definitely kind of like catered to an idea of like a nerd bro or something like that. But I loved there was one of the motifs in heavy metal was just like really, really, really like tiny waist, just like huge boobs, just like huge muscular thighs, women just like slicing open like an alien dude who was trying to come onto her, and their guts are like spilling out everywhere. And there's also a heavy metal, there's 2 heavy metal movies. But that genre of like lightly erotic kind of like sci-fi porn, I still really like, that's like one of my main influences, at least in self-portraiture. And now I have my own relationship to, I really like, I love the film, like Liquid Sky is like an important kind of like cyberpunk influence on me, and I love Samuel Delaney and Octavia Butler, and when I read Ursula K. Le Guin's like The Left Hand of Darkness, that like totally changed my life, and I always tell people to read that. But I've actually, I think there's people in here that that were like, you have to read this book. But I like literature. Because like sci-fi as a genre can get really bad. But I love when the process of reading it really like forces my brain to do work on like thinking of what that visual looks like, when the language itself makes me kind of have to decipher a new terrain or a new idea of like what a being could be. And so I love like the Xenogenesis series was what I read before this little the furry sci-fi wallpaper. Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy was really influential for that, because I also like science fiction. I also think is related, like everything's liberation theology, but science fiction to me in a lot of ways can do similar things. And in terms of how I got to the sort of like furry, futa, kind of like trappy, anime, sort of like deviant art porn world, I've always kind of been fascinated with that. Maybe there's a direct connection between that and Skinheads. I would be fascinated if there was. That would be really cool. If anyone has an inclination, any info on that, please give it to me. But my relationship to that was more indirect, because we just want to, because that show, the sort of trans-species show I did with my friend Carolyn, and Carolyn's work is using different models, so many different models to address questions of otherly abled bodies and illness and like chronic illness and the sort of like world surrounding our kind, like what does a sort of like disabled subjectivity look like? And so science fiction is also a really interesting realm in which to think about that, and the sort of historically, especially like legislatively, there's a direct link between the way that the public discourse surrounding like gender identity and the public discourse surrounding access of disabled people to resources, or what's categorized or earmarked for public funding. And so that kind of, the link between those two and kind of public discourse was a really interesting way to start. What might that look like mirrored in a kind of like speculative fiction world? And so that's kind of how it started. And so I'm sure there are connections, like the buttons, like I have a button maker now, so I just make buttons all the time. So anytime I can include them, I do. But I think there wasn't a direct connection between the two. Okay, yeah.